Yeah, so the first one would be if you didn't have an SDP, right? That would be probably your easiest option. The other one, I'm going to leave. We'll come back to that. There's a scenario for it that will address that as an issue. We'll see it in one of the scenarios. So yeah, cool. So AMC stuff, like I said, old guidance, some of it still applies. The part of this that's important is that this is AMC. So 202 says, yeah, you can use it. AMC is saying, yeah, we want our crews to use them. So that's an important piece. Anytime it says MAGCOM delegated or MAGCOM training, that's referring to your AMC sub to the 202. So that's important for us to still have that as an option. Okay. All right. We got an SCIF a couple months ago that said, hey, you can fly STPs, right? And it gives you some instructions on how to retrieve the STPs and how to use that. And then it also says that there's some training that's available for you on that website. I'm not going to make you raise your hands because we're all probably going to lie to me anyway. But my assumption is that not many people have gone and read the training. So that's why we're doing this too. But that's okay. The training is pretty generic, and I think we needed some C5 specific stuff from it as well. And then yeah, the first plane checklist. Will be revised to update some of this information. I don't sugarcoat things. If you want to read a memo that passes the buck more, go read A3T's training memo that says, if you go to the Jepson website and watch their video, consider yourself SDP trained. Because the guidance says you have to provide training. A3T said, right? And then at the bottom, they said, hey, if you want to document this training, it's not required, but units be choose to be more restrictive. We have decided to be more restrictive, right? So come 1 December, if you have not received this training, you are grounded. You cannot fly if you have not received this training. So for those of you guys out in Zoom land, you guys will still need to come in and participate in one of the scenarios. It's going to be a little bit difficult for you guys out there. So you'll have 90% of it, and you still need to sit down with an instructor to do that. So tell your friends, you need to get this training done before 1 December, otherwise you will not fly. You will be grounded. That's how important we think this is. You need to understand how to do this, how to safely go. Okay, next slide. Okay, here is the new departure planning checklist. So if you want to kind of follow along in your iPad, feel free to kind of see where this differentiates and where it kind of changes the order of priority, right? So this step here is essentially an operative climb gradient capability. Ensure that the airplane meets that one engine and operative. That's the ideal, right? So you go back to the 202 Vol 3 and how they have it set up. AMC is saying, hey, if you can make a climb gradient, 200 feet per nautical mile, if you can exceed that, one engine and operative, go for it, right? That's normal operations, the way we're used to it. And then so you just have to be able to meet a one engine operative, right? So that's the way we operate most of the time now. Nothing changed there. If all the minimum climb gradients are met, you're going to proceed to step 2. If unable to make minimum climb gradient, use one of the following methods to reduce the minimum climb gradient requirement. Okay, next. Sweet. So here's where AMC has taken the prioritization and has established it for us, right? This is where they've broken it down and said, okay, check engine and operative capability. If that doesn't work, you can reference either the SDP and where the computed CFL and climb out factor must be less than or equal to the maximum CFL or climb out factor combination on the SDP, and the airplane gross weight must be less than or equal to the SDP maximum takeoff weight. We'll show you some examples today in the scenarios. You get to see how that all works as you work with the TOL program. Alternatively, you are now also authorized to utilize non-standard takeoff minimums. So what does that mean? Non-standard takeoff minimums are ceiling this, and the 3 engine capability must meet or exceed required non-standard climb rating. So non-standard takeoff minimums, again, you'll see an example of this in the scenario today, where it'll talk about some non-standard takeoff minimums. They typically have a 200 foot per mile climb gradient, or you can, or they may have something higher published. But you are authorized to depart using non-standard takeoff minimums. Cool. Next slide. If both the SDP and non-standard takeoff minimums, you cannot depart using those, or they're not available, you may subtract up to 48 feet. And that's up to the piloting command's decision to do that. And you can, that's up to you. You can call back home, you can have a conversation, say, hey, what's the risk, right? Talk about, hey, what's the delta, right? Because a 48, subtracting 4 feet, right, off of a 48 foot climb rating versus subtracting all 48 feet or 47 feet is the big difference in my mind, right? Because 48 feet means 0 clearance, right? It's scraping the treetops. And the big difference between why we went to SDPs as a priority versus 48 feet as a priority is that the SDP looks for the best way to depart, right? So it looks around at Bagram, right, and sees all the mountains, and it says, go this way, do this, right? And some of them have turns. Same thing at Travis. It says, hey, go this way because this is where it tells you you're going to be the safest, right? Whereas subtracting 48 feet, you may be flying a departure that takes you straight over top of the mountain, right? And you're subtracting that 48 feet away from that. So the SDP kind of leads you to greener pastures in a proverbial sense versus maybe not so green pastures subtracting 48 feet. And so that's why they've made this change to say, hey, our preferred method is depart via the SDP because it's going to put you near in the best position potentially to not hit something. Okay. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to my engineer friends here who can talk to you through the performance data and what the difference between a 2-segment and 4-segment.
Yep, so we're going to get into a little bit of performance stuff. This will come into play later, but we just wanted to kind of cover the basics on our normal departure, right? So our normal departure consists of 4 segments. First segment, gear down, flaps 40, right? Then once we retract the gear and we're at flaps 40, that's our second segment. Then once we get to our flap retraction altitude, we're going to level off, accelerate up to our flap retraction speed, retract our flaps. Once the flaps are retracted, then we're going to accelerate to 250. Once we're at 250, we can continue our climb right to our 4th segment, to our final altitude. And this is what it looks like, right? So this is a graphical too low, right? Penetrate the OIS. So that's why when we calculate our told, okay, this is the appropriate flap retraction altitude, and then we can climb up. Versus if we climb up too high, same kind of thing, where we could penetrate our OIS. And that's the normal just profile. Any questions on that? Next slide. And then this is our climb gradient capability delta chart, right? So here's our OIS. Here's our 4-engine climb out requirement. And then when we actually calculate the data, right, we're calculating our 1-engine and operative climb performance if we're a positive below this, right? And so we'll get into some of that once we calculate the climb versus the 4-segment climb if we're grading down.
So how come as further and also what the identification service teams, some of the young co-pilots what the identification service, the bottom line.
Yep.
And the dotted line, the 4-engine climb out requirement, why does it get bigger and bigger the further away you get from the airport?
Yeah. Why do these two grow from each other?
Why is it getting bigger and bigger, right? Why is that delta?
Yeah. So what it's building into is our segments, right? So our segments, right? As we level off, and then we continue our climb, it's going to grow once we get into our fourth.
Because it compounds as you get further and further away from your field.
And if the OIS is 40 to 1 and a climb is 200 feet per mile, so you're 1 mile away, 200 feet above. Well, really, that's going to be what the OIS comes to the ground. This one raises gently, this one raises aggressively. So the further you go, the bigger.
Right, like you have to lift off. But if it gets further, if you get further and further away from the airfield, right, you have more pad beneath you, right? And that kind of goes back into 3 slides ago when you were talking about extensive mission planning, right? Where this comes into play, where you know, okay, if I go down this greater pasture at SDP, depending on where I lost my engine, right, this is how much play I have between myself and that obstacle. We'll get into it more, guys, but I just wanted to bring that over on.
Yeah, and that's all based on, it's all based on losing an engine at our go speed, right? So as you get further down their path and you have not lost an and then here's where we get into, so normally we calculate based on departure, it gives us a climb grading requirement, and we calculate that one engine and operative, right? So how do we ensure that we meet that 4 engine? So it's automatically indirectly assured by doing the 1 engine and operative climb requirement, right? So now the tricky part comes in when we're using the SDP as our contingency planning, right? So now the SDP and the departure are going to diverge from each other. How do we ensure both we meet the SDP 1 engine and operative, and we also meet the required climb grading for the departure, all engines out? When we do that calculation, if our negative delta exceeds 100, now we can ensure that we can meet that climb requirement, all engines operating. And that's where we get into the 2-segment climb. So the 2-segment climb chart is a 4-engine chart, and that'll give us our 4-engine climb gradient capability to ensure that we can meet it using the SCP. And then for the departure rating, we'll use, so normally if we're more than negative 100 delta, we're going to do the 2-segment climb, and then we calculate. That makes sense?
For the pilots, number one question I've been asked is how do I ensure my 4-engine climb gradient meets the capability, right? On our toll card, it does not list your 4-engine climb gradient capability, right? That's the number one question we always get is like, well, once I go to negative delta, or my negative delta is minus 70, how do I know that my 4-engine climb gradient is meeting the capability, right? And so what Kurt said, right, by your 4-engine flat track height altitude, okay? That's what ensures your 4-engine flat track altitude. So who remembers at Travis before they had the 300-foot phenomenal climb gradient? What was your HMFR 90% of the time?
1063.
Yeah, 1063, right? So you'd set 1070, right? What is it now on locals? It changes, right? What changed?
The 300.
Yeah, so it added that new climb gradient, right? So that angle, right, that they showed on this 4-segment climb, right? Now you have to hold your flaps longer, right? That's why your HMFR goes up higher. Your flaps are holding longer at 4 engines to ensure that you meet the climb gradient capability, right? So 1,000 feet is kind of the minimum, right? And usually we were just blasting out of that. So that's why 1,000 feet works, right? But in this case, you actually have to hold your flaps longer, get yourself up higher initially, and then you can accelerate. Does that make sense? So for 4-engine climb gradient capability, as long as your negative delta is less than 100 feet, right? You don't have to worry about your 4-engine climb gradient at all. It's indirectly assured based on your HMFR. Does that make sense? You'll never see a number of a 4-engine climb gradient unless you've exceeded negative 100 feet. And then you will see a 4-engine climb gradient capability. And we'll talk about that later. Cool. So in my pilot brain, I think of it, I try and break it down as simply as possible, right? There are 4 ways that you can depart, right? You're told should fall into one of 4 categories, essentially, right? I can meet my 3-engine climb gradient capability. right? I can't meet my 400 climb capability, but my negative delta is 0 to 99. Again, I'm just going to still take off, fly normal. If I were to lose an engine, I would execute the SDP. If I don't lose an engine, I'm just going to do what I do every other day, right? Just fly my runway heading to 10,000 or whatever it may be, right? My Apex 1 or whatever is going on, right? Because I still got 4 engines, I'm meeting that climb rating, right? If my negative delta is greater than 100 and my SDP is still valid, right? Then I execute a 2-segment climb. And what that's going to do is that 300 foot per nautical mile climb gradient, let's say your capability is 199 out of Travis, right? It's going to automatically make your flap attract height altitude 4,000 feet. 4 engine, right? So I'm going to drag my flaps all the way to my obstacle clearance altitude to ensure that I'm safe. Does that make sense? Questions about that, right? And then your 4th category is my SDP does not work. I can't depart via my SDP, right? Obviously, I can't depart 3 engine because it's less, right? Now I can potentially go into a 4 engine or a 48 foot subtraction, or I could utilize the non-steering takeoff and the non-steering takeoff. Make sense? 4 categories is how I think that.
Why does or be longer and climb out? Do you?
Why is it preferred to do the SDP?
Seems like to me that you're leaving gear up, flap.
2 different things here, right? If I lose the engine, to ensure that I don't hit anything, right? So that's option 1 to fly the SDP, right? So I take off at ghost speed, I lose an engine, right? I can't meet the climb ratings. I'm going to fly whatever that is, situation 1 and hit the next. Situation 2, right? So we're talking only here, right? So I have 2 plans, right? One is if I lose an engine, and the other is if I don't, right? So the 2-segment climb comes into play when I don't lose an engine. But my 4 engine flap, if my negative delta is less than 100 feet. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So now, in order to make sure that my 4 engine is meeting that 300 feet to 4,000 like it is here at Travis or whatever it may be, I'm leaving my flaps hanging until I reach that 4,000 feet, 4 engine, right? If I were 3 engine, I'm flying the SDP. 4 engine, I climb to 4,000 feet. 3 engine, I'm flying the SDP. And I'm leaving my flaps at 40 anyway, right? Until I get to a safe altitude, essentially. Okay. Does that make sense? The difference there. One piece that's not really well quantified is if I do lose that engine, when do I put my flaps on?
You may never.
You may never, right? I've got enough altitude, I've got enough air to get cleaned up, right? But initially, while you're flying that SDP, you want to hold your flaps as long as possible. Right? Just like 3 engine, right? Your 3 engine flap retract altitude is the altitude associated with your OIS, right? If I lose an engine normal, right? My 4 flap retract altitude goes out the window, right? And now transition to, if I lose, right? And so I can take part, right? And I lose an engine, I still wait until 4,000 feet before my flaps up, right? Your 3 engine is always a 2-segment climb. 4 engine is often a 4-segment climb, 90, whatever percentage of the time, mostly. Does that make sense?
We'll get into a couple of told examples. So this is a toll card that would look if we are able to meet or exceed our one engine and operative climb grading requirement, right? So here in this example, it shows 305 is our requirement, right, up to 4,000, and then we have a second one, 2,000 up to 5,000 basically. So then once we calculate the total, we look at our one engine operative climb gradient capability, right? It's 306, so it exceeds that. And then 300 exceeds the 200, right? So we're good, we're legal to take off. No SDP requirements, right? We can meet our departure climb gradient requirements, one engine operative, right? So that's our contingency plan. SDP, we fly our normal departures based on losing that engine, right? So we can meet or exceed that one. Make sense? Right? So we calculate our total, and our one engine operative climb gradient gradient capability is below our requirement. So we cannot meet our climb gradient requirement, one engine and operative. So what do? Now we use the SDP as our contingency planning. And so we have to calculate that total and make sure that, okay, our SDP is our one engine operative contingency planning, right? But we still need to make sure that we meet or exceed this all engines operating, right? Because if we don't lose an engine, we're going to continue to fly that departure route. And we have to make sure we exceed this, meet or exceed it, right? So it shows down here, we're at 254. So we're less than negative 100 delta, right? Does that make sense? Less than, you're shaking your head no? Okay.
You're within 100.
Yeah, so you're within 100 of that, right? So you're not greater than 100. So that means that you can meet this gradient requirement, all engines operating. That makes sense? Is there a question back there?
Based on your 4-engine flap retract altitude, right? So notice that your 4-engine flap retract altitude is higher than it usually is out of Travis, right? So you're still holding your flaps longer to get that altitude 4-engine, but now you can fly that profile. That make sense? 4-segment climb. Still flying a 4-segment climb, right? In that scenario.
So we'll show the data first, and then we'll get into the SDP. So here's the scenario where now, okay, your gradient requirement is 355, but my capability is 254, right? So it's greater than negative 100 delta. So now we have to go to a 2-segment climb, right? So 4-engine 2-segment climb, and that would adjust our flap retraction altitude to meet or exceed what our climb gradient requirement altitude is, right? So we're going to climb 2-segment all the way up to our climb gradient requirement altitude, right? And once we get to that, then we can climb. Does that make sense? So it's going to automatically shift us to a 2-segment climb. You can see here, this changes to a 4-engine gradient capability. And the total program is going to automatically do that for you in the new program, right? So 2.4. 2.4 hasn't been released yet. We are still using 2.3. So the issue here is if you're using 2.3, the total program won't automatically ensure that you meet or exceed this requirement all engines operating. So you as a crew have to make sure that, hey, I'm meeting or exceeding that. And if not, then you're going to have to, wait for conditions to improve, reduce your gross weight, whatever, until you meet that. Does that make sense? So when the new program comes out, it'll automatically have built-in protections to make sure that you meet or exceed this gradient requirement, all engines operating, right? And it'll automatically transition you to a 2-segment climb. Currently, it'll automatically transition you to a 2-segment climb, but it won't ensure that you meet or exceed your requirement.
Tells you what top it is, for the 2-segment climb, SDP criteria, it usually tells you how it got there.
Yeah, in the 2.4.
2.3 does that.
It does it too.
Yeah, but it won't ensure that.
It won't ensure it.
We'll tell you the little warning box up
Yeah.
there.
You had to transition to a 2-segment climb. It'll still tell you that, but it won't ensure that you're meeting that gradient requirement. Does that make sense? So here's the example of kind of what an SDP will look like. So to give you all your temperature, your max takeoff weight, max CFL, and max climb out factor. So, it'll tell you that weight is based on obstacle clearance, right? And then it also gives you a max CFL and a max timeout factor. So when we run the data, you'll click on the SDP block up in the top. So this the new one will look like one for removing 48 feet and one for SDP. The current 2.3 only has the SDP one. So you click on that, it'll give you a little pop-up. It'll have you enter your max, your max timeout factor and your max. In today's example, we are at 3.4, so we're below both those numbers, so we're clear to take off.
Does that make sense, everybody? Those are the two things that you cross-check. You're going to utilize the SDP.
And then if we're like cross-checking our total in the jet and we see that we're less than that, and now we push us to try to get to -48.
If this number, if CFL exceeds your, if the CFL exceeds the number that's in your SDP, so it's a really interesting question that you asked, right? I'm gonna go back all the way back to the guidance. And this is something that Adam and I are gonna have to probably take to A3B, right? It says if no other departure methods are available and the mission justifies the increased risk, the pilot may after extensive pre-flight plan reduce to 48 feet. If you can't meet the SDP, I don't know if that means it's available or not. Like the SDP is clearly available, right? But you wouldn't be able to depart, right? So in this case, right? So this is where you have it's a 51-foot positive or negative delta, right? So I can't subtract 48 feet in this scenario anyway, right? It's like either regardless of what I do, I can't take off, right? There may or may not be a scenario today talks about exactly what you're talking about and kind of hits on Sergeant Weir's question about the 48-foot subtraction, what defines it being available versus not available.
I know before the SDPs got validated, when we were using those SDPs, like for sims and stuff like that, it would blow the negative 48 miles out of the water. Like you wouldn't, even if you did subtract that, you still wouldn't get the same capability that SDP gave.
Yeah, in theory, the SDP actually should allow you to take off heavy, right? Because the SDP has a much lower climb rating capability.
Unless something's changed the SDP calculations. Jeppesen, right, who developed them, does not give us what that clearance is. True statement. Like it doesn't grow at that 41 surface like everything else calculated out does when we talk about two segment and 4 segment. Like it is very much customized to the terrain around that airfield. That's the risk, right? When it talks about extensive mission planning. Call me if I'm wrong. I'm going off the boogies and the B models as well.
It doesn't. It doesn't.
Yeah, they do. We have a slide that kind of covers that. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So this is what Jeppesen looks at, right? So this is our normal, right? 40 to 1, 152 foot per nautical mile, right? So TERPs, pan stops, they all use that procedure. Then they built in a required obstacle clearance, right? That's that 48 foot per nautical mile above that 152. And then this yellow line is what Jeppesen looks at, right? So they calculate a 1.2% up to 3.3 nautical miles, right? And then they level at 240, right? All the way out here to 21.4 miles, and then they increase at a 0.4 up to 30 nautical miles, right? So that's what Jefferson's looking at. So as they calculate that, any obstacle that penetrates that, that will be what your SDP limitation is based on.
So that's your best case scenario, but it could be less than that if there's an obstacle that they pick that up.
Yeah, so, but this is just what they're looking at. So this is what they're looking at, right? And then they give a couple examples. Here's an obstacle, here's an obstacle, here's an obstacle. So if any of these obstacles that penetrate this, Jefferson's gonna tell you, hey, this gross weight is based on that, and it'll make sure that you clear that obstacle.
Like 0 feet.
But, yeah, 0 feet. So in the, all the SDP training, it'll always show a 35-foot obstacle clearance. But that's an option that Jefferson has, but in the C5 model, it does not use that. The C5 model uses 0 feet, right? Paint scrape. So it's all the way down to that obstacle.
And that's what should kind of make the hair in the back of your neck stand up a little bit, because when you hit 240 feet, that could be, it looks like 5 miles in this example, based on that weight and altitude, et cetera. It could be 2 miles, it could be 7 miles, right? And then it's low, right? All the way out to 21.4. Like, think about that. 240 feet. How many things do you see around here? 21 nautical miles out. Like, what's 20 nautical miles? So unless you're like in Kansas, and even there, there's some other obstacles with towers and stuff that are being put up, like, it's pretty tricky, Rick, right? When you talk about extensive mission planning, you're looking at the partner. Where they're you've done it before. It's IMC. It's practice.
Yeah, and doesn't necessarily mean that there's obstacles out there, right? And then they'll make sure that that weight.
Like that, you have to be at the same corner as we go through the slides.
Sure.
At the end of it, I want you to be able to work on some problems. So let it sink in the background like maybe while this talks, and then when we're done with this speech, we'll have all the PC, you can do the exercises.
Sounds good. So this is what Jefferson looks at, right? Okay, so this kind of, we've already hit some of this stuff, right? Trying to reiterate again, that on takeoff, when an engine fails, that's an emergency, right? Contingency procedure. So we continue to hammer that home. That is point number one. That's been probably the second most requested question that we have is like, hey, I can't subtract 48 feet anymore. So, you know, I'm just going to tell ATC on departure, I'm going to fly runway heading because that's what my SDP is. No, you can't tell if the Pagenkoff 1 departure and you can't make that climb gradient. You can't say, well, my SDP says runway heading, so that's what I need to fly. No, you're going to fly the Pagenkoff 1 unless you lose that engine, right? On takeoff, right? So it is kind of like a split-second decision to be like, hey, we're transitioning to the SDP in the event of an engine failure. So that's what we're trying to get at. The cool thing about Jefferson is that when possible, they try and make it as simple as possible. So like we showed in that picture, which is the next slide, you can go to that. They're trying to make it, you lose an engine, just fly straight ahead. That's what they're trying to do, right? This, I think, is another important slide. When you talk about, hey, 0 feet of clearance, the other important piece to think about is that they only give you 600 meters either side of center line, right? If you've ever been in a sim, you lose an engine, the first thing that happens is you're like, what? Right? And you got crosswinds and everything else, right? You have to make sure that you maintain that 600 meters is all you get, either side of the center line out to 30 miles, right? So if you ever like looked back or watched somebody take off, you just watch them drift off into oblivion, right? Because the crosswinds are there, right? You lose that clearance altitude off of the SDP, right? This is what it looks like in terms of the design criteria.
That is no win. So crosswind, you gotta put that white track line on runway heading, not your heading mode. So I know the habit pattern is you're up heading select, but when you're flying, you don't fly that heading, you steer that white track bar into the heading mode, so that your plane is tracking runway heading.
This is just the math behind it. Again, straight out, less than a 15-degree turn. Like I said, it goes out to 1,968 feet either side of center, right? So about 4,000 feet total. Yeah, same thing. Great set come. All right, some places, Bagram's a great example. Travis, 2 on right, 2 on left is a great example. There's lots of examples out there. You'll see some today in scenarios that generate turning SDPs, right? So basically, like a Travis, straight ahead is not the best option, right? It doesn't lead you to those greener pastures that we talked about earlier. And so they'll develop a procedure that ensures that you need to follow, and then it will take you to a safer area away from the terrain. Again, like Kurt said, a lot of the terrain slides will show that 38.5 feet. We don't have that. It's 0 feet of clearance for us. Sweet. Yeah. They're based on flying the path, right? You gotta follow it almost exactly. And you should be prepared should an engine fail on takeoff, right? So then the question becomes, what if I've already taken off and I'm at 800 feet, I'm at 1,200 feet, I'm started a right turn, to go direct to Williams or whatever that point may be, right? So we call that the point of divergence, right? Yeah, another picture from Jefferson. So we call that the point of divergence, right? You can probably see it a little bit better on your slide. So this is the Wapex 1, which I know we never fly at Travis. And then this is the SDP for Travis, right? So the point of divergence is the point where whatever your clearance was or whatever you're actually flying starts to differ from what the SDP reading is, right? So at Travis here, this says at 7 DME, turn left to 140 to intercept the Skaggs Island radio outbound, the 095 outbound. And then here at Travis, Wapex 1 is climbing heading 212, turn right to intercept to Wapex, and that happens at 4.5 DME is where that happens, right? So your point of divergence on this SDP is 4.5 DME, right? So what happens after that if I lose an engine after 4.5? What are you gonna do? We'll get interactive.
You already made your turn.
Yeah, you already made your turn, right? So in my mind, the big overarching plan, right, of takeoff and having a contingency plan shouldn't just be point of divergence, I'm gonna take off, and after that, like, whatever, like, inshallah, what happens? We'll see, who knows? But in reality, you should be aware at all times where your terrain is and what's my new contingency plan now, right? Where am I gonna go if I'm right here and I've started this turn and I lose an engine? Am I gonna keep climbing to this 3,000 foot tall mountain over here that's the Vacaville Hills? No, I'm gonna turn on downwind where tower vectors meet all the time, right? So just because you've hit your point of divergence doesn't necessarily mean that you're in an unsafe scenario. The good news is you've climbed to 4.5 DME on 4 engines, right? So you've built that buffer 4 engine now, and ideally you put yourself in a position where you can make a good airmanship decision, right? But there's no guidance beyond the point of divergence, right? You get to be pilots and engineers and good CRM and talk about where you want to go and look at the JIPLIs, and hopefully you're in a good spot, right? But it's important to understand that once you make that turn at 4.5, there's no coming back. You can't come back and get back on the SDP because of how small that reading in that window is, right? So once you've hit that point of divergence, you're committed to whatever that departure is you've done. Travis's, pretty conservative. Again, you might find a scenario today where the SDP says go left, and the departure says at 400 feet, turn right, or whatever that may be, right? So identifying what your point of divergence is will help you to have a better going forward. Cool. Let's have some fun. Spread yourselves kind of, you have a computer, a couple of you come down here, please. One of you kind of come down to this corner. And pilots, find yourself an engineer that has a whole computer. We have more than that, we can do that.